Hi folks, welcome again to an online version of class. I hope to be back in the classroom with you on Tuesday, and we'll have a quiz on Tuesday. As you're probably aware from the syllabus, your review sheet will be up by class time tomorrow for you, class time Thursday I should say. Today we're going to be talking about material from chapter 3 of the Robbins textbook. So this is our first full chapter from the Robbins, Hinson Moore textbook. So I hope that you guys have taken the time to read it so that what I'm talking through will seem like some review and just some slightly different perspectives on the material. This is the first time that we're talking specifically in depth about solutions. And that's what we're going to be doing through the next few weeks, is kind of talking about perspectives that people have taken to understand environmental problems and create solutions. And so the one we're starting with here is those that are based on markets. So they're based on the capital systems, they're based on companies and the ways that they approach problems. And so there are some very particular solutions that we're going to see. And there are several theories. So if you've already read the book, you know some about these theories, but I hope that this lecture will just help clarify that for you a little bit. So let's dig right in. Okay. So we're going to start from the perspective of thinking about an environmental problem, and that is single-use plastics. So all these things you see in this picture, these are single-use plastics. You can see the clamshells that you might take food home in, soda bottles, plastic string, water bottles, paper bags, plastic bags, bottle caps. I don't see any plastic utensils, but those are something else we often think of as single-use plastics. So this is a problem, and we want to first understand why it's a problem and then think about it from the solutions perspective. So why might single-use plastics be an environmental problem first? We've already talked about this a little bit, just mentioned here and there, but what do you think? Why are single-use plastics a problem? Okay. Well, they cause a lot of pollution out in the ocean. That's one of the things that we know about them. They're great big trash gyres out in the Pacific Ocean that are all just plastic trash that has washed in from all over the place and is spinning in the ocean. And as it's sitting there in the ocean, it's not always that those big pieces that you can see in those two photographs are a problem. Sometimes it's more that the plastics break down into really small pieces, and those small pieces get eaten by the organisms in the ocean. So not only do you see, sea lions with straws in their noses, but you see a lot of different sea life, from fish all the way up to big mammals like whales, that have a bunch of plastic in their stomachs. And you have to keep in mind, that's not just a problem for them, that's a problem for us, because we are eating that sea life. And if we're eating that sea life, we are getting those same plastics into our systems. Now, another reason why plastics are a problem is highlighted by this graphic on the left-hand side. So plastics, and indeed, I'm going to go back for a minute, all of those things that you see in that image, the styrofoam as well as what you're used to calling just plastic, all of those are made from petroleum. So we're using up petroleum that, it's the same stuff that we turn into gasoline for our cars, diesel for our trucks, and so forth. So we have to use lots and lots of oil in order to make these plastic goods. So that requires a lot of energy to bring the oil up out of the ground, to make the plastic bottles, to transport the plastic bottles. So if we have this big problem of pollution, this big problem of resource use, what can we do about it? So let's think about it for now from the perspective of market-based solutions. Okay, so a few potential market-based solutions we could come up with. We could have a green tax. So with a green tax, single-use plastics, we would charge an extra fee for those single-use plastics. So on top of, let's say you spend $1.50 on buying a bottle of water at the airport store, well, now you're going to pay $1.55, and 5 cents will be the green tax on that bottle. And let's say we use those tax monies to fund education on reusable containers. So instead of having people buy a lot of single-use plastics, we are instead getting containers that we can use over and over again. So we can take, for example, we can take it down to the cub and refill our reusable container over and over and over again. And that partly, that education that green tax has brought us will teach us that, hey, we're also going to save money with those reusable containers. So a green tax is anything that charges an extra fee on something that we see as an environmental bad. And so in this case, on those single-use plastics, we're charging an extra fee. Another option would just have the companies themselves encourage green consumption. They might say, hey, buy more reusable containers. And that's part of what we were advocating with that green tax education system, right? Okay, so if they're saying companies are encouraging green consumption, they might be telling us, for example, which particular things we should buy and which ones we should not if we want to be environmentally friendly. So they might tell us, for example, hey, you should buy all wooden containers or something like that. Which you might say, well, how am I supposed to store my soup in a wooden container? So we have to sometimes think of creative solutions. Okay, so third, as a market-based solution, is green certification. So we might have a certification system that we create. So maybe some of the companies that have been selling single-use plastics get together and they say, okay, we've noticed that consumers are complaining a lot about all the single-use plastics and they're making us look bad. So let's create a certification system that says that our product can be reused so many times. That say, let's start making products that we tell consumers they can be reused at least 100 times. And so if we say that you can use it that many times, we're going to slap this label onto it, and then customers will know that that's a good product to buy. Okay, so a green certification system is somebody creates a system that slaps a label onto something that helps you know if it's a good thing to buy or not. Okay, so these are all potential market-based solutions to the problem of single-use plastics. So market-based environmental solutions generally, they aim to improve the environment by creating changes in the way companies or markets work. So we'll get to a bigger markets piece in a minute. And usually market-based environmental solutions are created partly because someone, and oftentimes the government, is trying to get business on board with a solution that will work for them. So they're trying to craft a solution that will make sense for business, but will also decrease environmental harm. So that's what market-based solutions are all about. Help make business happy, but also decrease the environmental harm. Now, the question is, do market-based solutions work? The answer is it depends on which problem you're talking about. So you really have to understand the system when you're trying to create solutions. And so one of the ways of understanding systems of markets is what is called the market response model. So you guys read about that for today. And so the market response model says that we have a given commodity. So let's say that we're talking about wood for paper. And let's say we're going to start up at the top where there's the resource availability rectangle. So we've got wood that we're using for paper. And we're using a whole lot of wood for paper. And the particular kind of wood that we're using is starting to become short in supply. It's getting harder and harder to get enough wood for paper of the kind that we want. So we're getting resource scarcity. So we move down to that lower rectangle of resource scarcity. And so the prices start to rise. And the market response model says one of two things will happen. So we'll follow the arrow to the right first. So someone may go out and search for new sources of the particular kind of tree we like to use for paper. Or there may be an increased output in the known sources. In this case, let's say somebody goes out and plants a new source of the particular kind of trees we like, and it happens to be a tree that grows up in only about 10 years, these really fast-growing poplars maybe. And so now we have a source that will allow the supply to increase. At least in 10 years, our supply will increase. So if somebody's been paying attention to how much is available of that wood, then perhaps that supply is constantly being replenished by new forests being planted. All right, so we get a response to the problem of resource scarcity that replaces the resource with more of the trees that we want. Okay, now let's go back to the resource scarcity rectangle there, and we say, okay, we have a shortage of this tree that we like. So the prices start to rise, and instead we go to the left arrow. And the left arrow takes us to using, let's take the first one, we use some substitutes. So instead of using that particular tree that we like, we start using bamboo for our paper. And so we had a real shortage of the kind of tree that we liked, but now we have plenty of bamboo, and so the demand for that particular kind of tree goes down. And so maybe those trees just start to regrow on their own. And so either way, we get less resource scarcity because we have a response in the market to something that is changing. And you can notice that in each of the response boxes on the bottom right and the bottom left, there are a few different ways that it can happen. If we increase efficiency, for example, that can cause demand to decrease. If we recycle more, that can cause demand to decrease. Okay, so let's consider efficient cars. So say we're concerned about the availability of oil. So our resource availability up at the top is oil. And we start to notice resource scarcity of that oil. Okay, so we come down to our bottom right and to our bottom arrows, and we choose whether we're going right or left. And in this case, we're going to go left because we're going to increase the efficiency of our cars so that we don't need as much oil. Okay, so yay, we're in good shape. We have plenty of oil because, hey, we have more efficient cars now. So we should expect the demand to decline, right? Okay, the problem in the market response model comes in, for example, with something like efficient cars, and that we find that the more we have efficient cars, the more people get more cars and more cars and more cars. So even though we have more efficient cars, we still end up using the same amount of oil. So the market response model helps to make a lot of sense of a lot of resource use systems, but it doesn't always do a perfect job of predicting what is going to happen when we try, for example, to make things more efficient. Sometimes we have an outcome that we weren't entirely expecting. Okay, another way to understand market systems is the Coase theorem. And the Coase theorem applies to situations where you have a particular environmental bad. And the example given in your textbook is a ranch. We're going to use a large-scale dairy as our example because large-scale dairies are becoming increasingly the way that a lot of our milk is produced. And a lot of those dairies look something like what you see in these images. So you have a lot of cattle on a whole bunch of barren land, and trucks come around on a regular basis to feed them up on corn and other nutrients that they need. But they spend most of their time penned up without grass, eating feed, and you can see them in the bottom image. They're eating the feed that's been dropped down for them. So they're not grazing in a pasture, they're eating feed that's been brought to them. And those dairies often end up being very smelly because you have a whole lot of cattle in one space, and because they're not out on pasture, it means that their manure is kind of sitting and not getting used up by plants. So it's rotting, like there are a lot of cattle in one place, and a lot of manure is rotting in place. And so that manure tends to cause smell, and it tends to cause flies. I used to live a few miles from 6 different dairies like this, and they caused both of these problems on a regular basis. Fortunately, I didn't live downwind of these dairies. So these dairies are causing pollution to their neighbors. They're causing smell pollution, and they're causing fly pollution. Potentially, they may be causing some other respiratory illnesses too, as dust gets kicked up from the manure. And as you'll remember, when we're talking about something that comes from a business that is not covered within the business costs, but rather something that is imposed on somebody outside of the business. We mentioned it can be a positive thing or a negative thing, but in this case, we're talking about a negative thing. That is called an externality of the business. So the dairy is producing a lot of smell, waste, and flies, and they are not covering that cost. So their neighbors may come along and say, Well, let me create a contract with you. And with that contract, you are going to agree to pay for traps that will catch the flies, because I'm most worried about those flies getting to my house. They're causing all kinds of disgustingness in my kitchen. So if you make a contract with me to pay for the fly traps to keep them out of my house, then I will not sue you for all of your environmental pollution. So it's essentially a way for the business to ensure that they don't have a nuisance of somebody suing them for the problems that they're causing. Okay, so the Coase solution says creating a contract between the two parties, the one creating the externality and the one experiencing the pollution, is the best solution to the environmental problem. Okay, so far so good. We get the neighbor is happy because there are fewer flies. The dairy person is happy because they're not experiencing a lawsuit. We're in good shape. Okay, but every time the person creates, the dairy person creates contracts, it costs things to the business. It may cost time because they have to go out and negotiate the contract with each person. It's probably going to cost a lawyer who's going to have to negotiate those contracts and find ways to ensure that they're carried out. It may cost some, obviously it's going to cost some, in this case, purchases of fly traps to ensure that this person does not sue you. So you as the dairy person are having to pay for a lot of things in order to get this contract in place. So those, you can have potentially high transaction costs. If it's just you, the dairy person, having a contract with your neighbor, those transaction costs rather, they may not be too much. But what if there are lots and lots of people that you are having to pay, having to develop contracts with? So for example, in last fall, there was a hurricane that went through North Carolina, and North Carolina has a lot of hog farms. And hog farms have lots of manure lagoons. So that's what we can see in this picture on the bottom. Those pink parts, those are manure lagoons. And you can see the flooded area around. So those manure lagoons are flooding out into what is flowing to the local rivers. And so people who lived close to the hog farms or anywhere near the rivers were experiencing pollution from the hog farms. So all of a sudden, a single hog farm could be polluting hundreds or even thousands of people downstream as well as nearby neighbors. And so those hog farmers, all of a sudden, if they're trying to use the Coase theorem to solve their environmental problem that they're causing, they're going to have to make a lot of contracts. And so if they're making a lot of contracts, imagine all the lawyers they have to pay, imagine all the times they have to send, even if they just hire one lawyer, they're going to have to send that lawyer out to a lot of different people to make agreements for how they're going to solve this problem of environmental pollution. So the Coase theorem works great if you just have a couple of parties. But when you start having a lot of people who are being affected by the pollution, the Coase theorem doesn't work nearly as well. So contracts between two parties only work well between two parties. Once you start to get a lot of people, it gets far too expensive. Okay. Are there other times that markets don't provide good environmental solutions? Well, even if we don't look at environmental solutions, there are some ways in which markets sometimes fail. So we looked at transaction costs. We looked at the expense of enforcing those contracts. But also, people in agreements about environmental problems don't always have equal information. So the neighbor and the dairyman may not have equal information. Another example of potentially unequal information is if you, let's say, live near a dry cleaner. Now, dry cleaners have gotten a lot better in recent years, but even now, and much more in the past, dry cleaners were sometimes known for their chemicals getting into the groundwater within about a mile of the dry cleaning store, we'll call it. So dry cleaning store. And so neighbors living nearby might have, if they were drilling a well down near the dry cleaner, they may have to experience toxins that are in the groundwater, but they may not know it. So the market can't solve the problem if the people experiencing the problem don't even know it's there. And so that's one of the problems where markets sometimes fail. If the problem has not been identified, If there is no reason for the market to go out and try to identify that problem is not going to be resolved. And the only way that somebody knows that they have pollution in the groundwater is if somebody goes out and tests it. So there has to be a reason to do that. Your average person living in a house isn't necessarily going to think to do that. So that's where you often have to have somebody outside who knows that things need to be tested, like government regulators, for example. Okay, another way in which markets sometimes don't provide good solutions are when monopolies and monopsonies develop. So I'm going to pause there just a second. All right, apologies for that. A little need for some water. Okay, so another time that markets don't necessarily provide good solutions are when there are monopolies and monopsonies. So monopoly is when you only have one entity to buy from. Like a lot of us right now, we may only have one internet company that will provide to our location. So we may have a monopoly that is controlling our internet access. Monopsony is you have a lot of sellers and they only have one buyer. So one example of that is in the chicken processing industry. So a lot of for example, Tyson is one of the companies that buys a lot of chicken, and a lot of farmers have gotten into a situation where the only person they're allowed to sell or able to sell to is, or I should say company, the only company they're able or allowed to sell to is Tyson or one of the other few big meat processors. So that makes it very difficult to change what is going on. If you only have one person you can buy from or only one person that you can sell to, and they're causing a big environmental problem, you can't make choices in the market. And that's part of where markets are supposed to be useful, is in providing you choices, providing you options that allow you to influence through your consumption the way that the world is working. So you should be able to choose the more environmentally friendly thing. And in the case of monopoly and monopsony, you can't do that. And an example that the Robinson and Moore textbook gave of this was that before a lot of water companies got taken over back near the early part of the 20th century when water was starting to be piped into houses. A lot of the water companies were private instead of publicly owned. Nowadays, usually cities own their own water systems and they control how it gets distributed and they control how much is charged for. But at the beginning of things, they were often private water companies. And private water companies were often not very good at keeping their water clean. So monopoly and monopsony can mean that environmental problems are harder to solve because simply the market is not working effectively when you have monopoly and monopsony. Again, because it's limiting choice. Okay, so what are some good, useful market-based solutions? One we've talked about already are green taxes. And an example of this that has worked really well already is carbon taxes in British Columbia. By instituting a carbon tax in British Columbia, they've been able to raise a lot of funds, but they have also decreased their carbon emissions substantially. So it's been beneficial to the province as a whole. Another example that we haven't talked about yet is cap and trade. Cap and trade is a market-based solution wherein, let's look at our image here, you have an agreement that's made, and this is usually made at the government level, about how different polluters are going to deal with their pollution. Okay, so imagine we've got this simplified case here, and we're going to talk about sulfur dioxide, even though that image talks about carbon. So we have here two different power plants. And let's say that the power plant on the left is a very old coal-burning power plant. And the power plant on the right is a much newer natural gas-fired power plant. Okay, so the coal power plant on the left, they have a lot of emissions. And the government comes in and says, okay, you are only allowed to emit 400 tons of sulfur dioxide every year. And so they cap sulfur dioxide emissions at 400 tons. Okay, well, the power plant on the right, they say, well, we only emit 200 tons of sulfur dioxide every year. So, hey, we're happy. And the government says, well, great. Well, in that case, you can sell your extra 200 credit that you have to spend, you have up to 400 tons that you can spend and you're only spending 200, you can sell that for actual money to the other power plant. And that other power plant that is emitting 600 tons of sulfur dioxide every year, they now are allowed to emit that 600 tons of sulfur dioxide because they bought the 200 tons from the other emitter. So they have added to their 400-ton permit. They now have 600 tons. And the other one, the emitter on the right, they are only going to emit 200 tons. They've agreed to this. And by instituting a system like this in the United States, mentioned before, we got a big reduction in sulfur dioxide emissions. So it took a combination of working with government and the industry in order to make this happen. So you have to notice that market-based solutions are not always just something that's created by companies or created within markets. That oftentimes, if we're talking about altering the way markets work, we need somebody up above the markets who is helping to figure out what the details should be and who is laying out rules so that they're fair for everyone. So that is what the government's role is in cap and trade. They're helping to lay out the rules, they're setting the cap, and they're creating the permit system. So they're creating this system where one emitter can buy pollution that another emitter doesn't need. And so they're able to ensure that everybody's able to decrease their pollution overall simply by trading their permits. And it's worked great so far for sulfur dioxide emissions ever since the 1990s. Okay, what are some other useful market-based solutions? Well, we've mentioned these a little bit when we talked about plastics. One is green consumption. So we can simply choose to buy green products. And then there's green certification. We could have some entity come along and certify that products are indeed green. And so there's a label on the products that lets us know that it's a good, environmentally friendly product to buy. And if you look over on the right, you see a tuna. And the US government actually helped make a tuna certification program happen that's helped to create a much more environmentally friendly tuna catch than in the past, which we'll talk about later in the semester. So green certification can work really well, but again, you'll notice that it's a combination of government and industry working together. One problem with green consumption, though, is greenwashing. And we mentioned this a few weeks back when we talked about BP, what used to be British Petroleum. So sometimes companies will claim that their products are green or claim that their company is green, which means, environmentally friendly. But their products might not be any more environmentally friendly than other comparable products. So you have to keep an eye out for that. Like if there's a label that says it's environmentally friendly, is it a label that you recognize? Is there a particular certification that you know about that's recognizable? Like there are particular forest certifications to ensure that your lumber is being harvested in a more environmentally friendly way. Do you recognize that certification that they've got? If not, you might want to distrust it. And if you just see that a company has put, lots of green ink all over their packaging or something, don't trust that that means that they're actually environmentally friendly. Look into it first, see what you can find out. So don't trust greenwashing. Try to make sure that you know that it's not greenwashing. Okay. So there are a lot of problems that markets can go some way to addressing, especially when markets are working in collaboration with government regulation. So trying to bring the two together to find solutions that are effective for both industry and for the people who are affected by environmental problems, which is all of us living in the world, living in the United States in this case. But some problems are really hard for markets to address when it comes to environmental problems. So for example, if the thing that we value is replaced by another resource, like we saw in the market response model, but it's already declined so much that it has trouble recovering, then the market can't really do anything for that resource. And Robinson and Moore talk about sperm whales in that regard. They said, we switched from sperm oil to kerosene back in the 19th century, but by that time we'd already killed so many sperm whales that the population could not recover for a long time. It has not recovered to this day. So we can have a huge impact on the environment in ways that the market just does not address because the market is not looking out to protect things that have been replaced by a new resource. The market as far as markets function. It's just caring about providing that resource that we need in our system. But it's not made. Markets are not formed to look out specifically for the environment. That's not built into the way that they work. And so we get the loss of sperm whales. Similarly, rainforests and the things that they do are not really well valued by economic measures. This is something that a lot of economists have worked on addressing, but there's still not a really satisfactory resolution to valuing things like rainforests for what they give us. Because rainforests do things like clean the water. As the water falls through the system, passes through the soil, passes through the rivers, the water gets cleaned up. Rainforests literally clean the air. Pollution passes in, spends some time passing through leaves, getting passed in and out through the pores of the leaves over time, and cleans up the air. And carbon dioxide storage also happens in the forest. So a lot of our problems with greenhouse gases, for example, are taken care of in part by the rainforest. But the market does not value those things. There is no market value for clean air. There's no market value for clean water. And except in places like British Columbia, where there's a carbon tax, there isn't necessarily a market value for carbon dioxide storage. So the market doesn't have any way to help us look for substitutes. Another way the markets sometimes don't do well at solving environmental problems is if the thing that we value is really complex. So similarly to the rainforest, if we're talking about the things that rivers do for us, carrying water, being a place where fish can live, being a place where we can boat and enjoy ourselves, being a place where we can simply relax next to on a nice summer day. If we're talking about wetlands that do an extremely thorough job of cleaning up our water, and that also provide habitat for a lot of the foods that we eat, for a lot of the wildlife that we love, that have a lot of beauty to them. The market doesn't really do a good job of valuing those things. And so market-based solutions don't sometimes address problems in systems like that very well. And then finally, there are problems that markets can't address because some people have more money than other people. And so what that means is that oftentimes clean environments tend to be closest to people with more money. Toxic waste dumps, according to a lot of research that has been done, tend to end up located near poor neighborhoods and near neighborhoods filled with people of color. So we call that environmental injustice, this problem where environmental bads often end up near people of color and poor people. And so markets don't do a good job of addressing that because, again, markets are about money. And so who has more money tends to have more influence and control. And therefore, people who are living next to the toxic waste don't necessarily have a lot of control over what happens with the toxic waste. All right, so that covers the big pieces that I want you to be aware of for Chapter 3 on market-based solutions. Let me know if you have any questions on this. Be aware that all of the chapter, including all that we've talked about today, is fair game for your upcoming quiz. All right, folks, have a great weekend, and I look forward to seeing you in person again next week.